The father's justice. 3 days after open-heart surgery, Daniel Carter lay in a hospital bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of machines that had kept him alive when his own heart nearly failed him. His chest felt like it had been split open, because it had. Every breath came with a dull, pulling pain, a reminder that survival had a cost. But the physical pain wasn't what kept him awake. It was the silence. He reached for his phone with trembling fingers, more out of instinct than hope. There was only one call he wanted to make, one voice he expected to hear. Ryan. His son. The boy he had raised with calloused hands and sleepless nights. The man he believed would show up when it mattered most. Daniel pressed the call button and held the phone to his ear. It rang once, then stopped. A message appeared on the screen. Call failed. He frowned, tried again. Same result. Again. And again. Until finally, the truth settled in with a cold, suffocating weight. Ryan had blocked his number. Daniel stared at the screen, his reflection faintly visible against the dark glass. For a moment, he thought it had to be a mistake, a glitch, something temporary. But deep down, he knew better. People didn't accidentally block their fathers. Not after a surgery like this. Not when death had been just one wrong heartbeat away. A nurse walked in, her voice calm, routine, almost detached from the storm unfolding inside him. She explained discharge procedures, medications, and restrictions. Then she asked the question that should have had a simple answer. Who's picking you up? Daniel hesitated. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was no one. His apartment was only a short distance away, but it might as well have been across the country. He couldn't drive, couldn't carry anything heavier than a few pounds, couldn't even trust his own body to hold steady for long. And yet, there was no one coming. Around him, other patients were surrounded by family. Voices filled the room, soft reassurances, quiet laughter, the sound of people who showed up, wives holding hands, children adjusting pillows. Someone is complaining about hospital food while still staying close. Daniel had none of that. Just the hum of machines and the echo of a life that suddenly felt very far away. He turned his head slowly toward the window, watching cars move in and out of the parking lot below. Each one carried someone home. Each one meant someone was waiting. But not for him. For the first time in 60 years, Daniel Carter understood something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Not exhaustion, not fear, but abandonment. And it didn't come from a stranger. It came from the one person he had given everything to. Daniel Carter had never thought of himself as a remarkable man. He didn't build companies or wear expensive suits. He didn't have a title that turned heads. For more than 3 decades, he showed up to the same factory floor before sunrise, long before most of the city was awake. The air was thick with chemicals, the kind that clung to your clothes and settled deep into your lungs. He learned to live with it. Learned to ignore the headaches, the burning eyes, the quiet warnings his body gave him over the years. Because there was always something more important waiting at home. Ryan. When his wife died suddenly, the world didn't just shift, it collapsed. One moment, Daniel was a husband with a plan. Next, he was a single father holding an 8-year-old boy who didn't understand why his mother wasn't coming back. There was no time to grieve the way he wanted, no space to fall apart. Ryan needed stability. He needed someone who wouldn't break. So Daniel made a choice. Every single day, he chose his son. He worked double shifts when money got tight. He skipped meals without mentioning it, making sure Ryan never noticed the difference. He wore the same worn-out jacket through winters that cut through bone, while saving every extra dollar for school supplies, tuition funds, and anything that might give his boy a better future. There were nights he came home so exhausted he could barely stand, but he still sat at the kitchen table, helping Ryan with homework he barely had the energy to understand. He showed up to every school event, even if it meant losing sleep before another long shift. He learned how to cook meals he had never made before, just to make sure Ryan felt normal, cared for, loved. And slowly, it paid off. Ryan grew up smart, driven, and determined to escape the life Daniel had known. College acceptance letters came, then law school, then a career in a world Daniel had only ever seen from a distance. Glass buildings, expensive suits, conversations filled with words that sounded foreign to a man who had spent his life working with his hands. Daniel didn't understand that world, but he didn't need to, because to him it meant one thing. It meant his sacrifices had worked. Everything he had given up, every long shift, every quiet struggle, every moment he chose to endure instead of complain, had built a future where his son would never have to live the life he did. And that had always been enough. More than enough. Success changed Ryan Carter, but not all at once. At first it was subtle, the kind of change you could explain away if you wanted to believe everything was still the same. Phone calls became shorter. Conversations felt rushed, squeezed in between meetings and deadlines. Where there used to be laughter and long stories, there were now quick updates. Efficient, polite, distant. "Work's been crazy, Dad." That became the answer to everything. Daniel told himself it was normal. This was what he had worked for, wasn't it? A life where his son was busy, important, in demand. A life where Ryan didn't have to worry about factory shifts or overdue bills. So Daniel adjusted. He stopped calling as often, didn't want to interrupt, didn't want to be a burden. Then the calls turned into texts. Short messages, delayed replies, sometimes hours, sometimes days. Holidays felt different too. Birthdays became a quick, happy birthday, sent between meetings. Christmas turned into gift cards mailed in envelopes, with no visit, no shared meal, no time spent together. Each change was small, easy to ignore on its own. But together, they built a distance Daniel could feel, even if he didn't know how to name it. When Ryan got married to Lauren, Daniel hoped things might shift back, that maybe family would bring them closer again. Instead, it seemed to widen the gap. Their lives moved in a different direction, one filled with upscale neighborhoods, social events, and conversations Daniel didn't quite fit into anymore. Visits became rare, and when they did happen, they felt scheduled, like obligations, not moments of connection. Daniel never complained. He never asked for more. Because somewhere deep down, he convinced himself this was just how life worked. Children grow up, they move on, they build their own worlds. But there were moments, quiet ones, when the truth slipped through. Moments when he realized he wasn't just being left behind, he was being left out. Not all at once, but slowly, carefully. One missed call at a time. The discharge papers were ready long before Daniel Carter was. A nurse stood at the foot of his bed, calm but firm, explaining what would happen next. Medications, restrictions, follow-up appointments, and then the question that mattered more than anything else. "Who's taking you home?" Daniel looked down at his hands, still weak, still unsteady. The answer should have been simple. It should have been Ryan. It should have been family. But there was no one. "I'll manage," he said quietly. The nurse didn't move. She had heard that answer before. "You just had major heart surgery, Mr. Carter. You can't be alone. Not yet." Daniel gave a small nod, but inside something tightened. He had spent his entire life taking care of himself, of others. Now, for the first time, he was being told he couldn't. And worse, there was no one willing to step in. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence until the door opened again. Dr. Michael Hayes walked in. He carried himself with a kind of quiet authority, the kind that didn't need to be announced. Silver hair, steady eyes, a presence that made people listen without raising his voice. He had been the one who performed Daniel's surgery, the man who had quite literally held his life in his hands. "I hear we have a situation," Dr. Hayes said, glancing briefly at the nurse before turning his attention to Daniel. "It's nothing," Daniel replied. "I'll figure something out." Dr. Hayes studied him for a moment longer than most people would, not judging, just seeing. "No," he said finally. "You won't." The words weren't harsh, just certain. Daniel frowned slightly, unsure how to respond. "You can't go home alone," Dr. Hayes continued. "Not safely, not after what your body has been through. I don't have a choice." There was a pause. Then Dr. Hayes made an offer Daniel never expected. Come stay at my house. Daniel blinked, thinking he had misheard. I'm sorry. What? I have the space. I have a full-time nurse. You'll have proper care, meals, everything you need until you're stable again. It didn't make sense. People didn't do things like this. Not for strangers. Not without a reason. I can't impose like that, Daniel said, shaking his head. That's too much. It's not an imposition, Dr. Hayes replied calmly. It's the right thing to do. Daniel hesitated. Pride rose first. The instinct to refuse, to say he'd be fine, even when he clearly wasn't. He had lived his entire life standing on his own 2 feet. Accepting help, especially this kind of help, felt unfamiliar, uncomfortable. But then reality settled in. The empty apartment, the stairs, the medications he barely understood. The silence was waiting for him. And the truth he could no longer ignore. He couldn't do this alone. Okay, Daniel said finally, his voice quieter than before. Just for a little while. Dr. Hayes nodded, as if he had already known the answer. That afternoon, everything changed. Instead of struggling to find a way home, Daniel was helped into a car waiting outside the hospital. The city passed by in a blur as they drove through neighborhoods he had only ever seen from a distance. Quiet streets, large homes, a different kind of life. When they arrived, Daniel sat still for a moment, staring at the house in front of him. It wasn't just a home. It was something else entirely. And somehow, for reasons he didn't yet understand, he had just been invited inside. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Daniel Carter lay awake in a bed far too comfortable for a man like him. The pain in his chest had dulled to a steady ache, but his mind refused to rest. Everything about this situation felt unreal. A stranger had opened his home, offered care, and asked for nothing in return. It didn't make sense. A soft knock broke the silence. Come in, Daniel said. Dr. Michael Hayes stepped inside, dressed simply now. No white coat, no hospital presence, just a man. He walked in slowly and took a seat near the window. Can't sleep? He asked. Daniel let out a faint breath. Too much to think about. Dr. Hayes nodded, as if he had expected that answer. After a moment he spoke again, but this time, his voice carried something different. Do you remember a summer job, about 35 years ago, at a plant near the river? Daniel frowned slightly, caught off guard by the question. Yeah, I worked a temp job during a layoff. Why? Dr. Hayes leaned forward, his eyes steady. There was a student working nights back then, broke, exhausted, trying to get through medical school but barely holding on. Daniel listened, unsure where this was going. One winter, that student found an envelope in his mailbox. No name, no return address. Inside was $500 and a short note. Daniel's chest tightened. Not from pain, but from memory. Keep going, someone believes in you. The words hung in the air. Daniel's eyes slowly lifted to meet his. That was you? He asked quietly. Dr. Hayes gave a small nod. I was that student. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel leaned back slightly, trying to process it. He had done things like that, here and there, small acts, quiet ones, never for recognition, never expecting anything in return. Most of them he had forgotten. But this one had not been forgotten. That money kept me in school, Dr. Hayes continued. More than that, it kept me from quitting. I was ready to walk away. I thought I wasn't good enough, that I didn't belong there. He paused, his voice steady but heavier now. You changed that, without even knowing who I was. Daniel shook his head slowly. I didn't do it for anything back. I know, Dr. Hayes said. That's exactly why it mattered. The room felt different now. What had seemed like an act of generosity now carried history, meaning, connection. People think big moments change lives, Dr. Hayes added quietly. But sometimes, it's the small ones, the ones no one sees. Daniel looked down at his hands. $500. At the time, it had been a sacrifice. Money he couldn't really afford to give, but he had done it anyway, because something told him it mattered. And now, 35 years later, That moment had come back, not as repayment, but as something greater. A reminder. That kindness doesn't disappear. It waits, and when the time is right, it finds its way back. The first morning in Dr. Hayes's house felt unfamiliar, but not uncomfortable. Daniel Carter woke up to something he hadn't felt in a long time. Quiet, without loneliness. Sunlight filtered through wide windows, soft and steady, not harsh like the factory lights he had known for decades. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then, the faint ache in his chest reminded him he wasn't alone anymore. Susan Parker knocked gently before entering, her presence calm and professional. She checked his vitals, adjusted his medications, and explained everything with patience that Daniel hadn't realized he needed. There was no rush in her voice, no irritation, just steady care. Later, Linda Brooks stopped by from the hospital, making sure his recovery was progressing as expected. Between the two of them, every detail was handled. Every concern anticipated before Daniel even had to ask. It felt strange, not because it was too much, but because he had gone so long without it. Meals arrived on time, warm and carefully prepared. Not frozen dinners, not something rushed between shifts, real food. The kind that made you sit down and actually taste it. Daniel found himself eating slower, not out of caution, but because, for once, there was no reason to hurry. The house itself was quiet, but not empty. There was life in it, in the soft footsteps down the hallway, in the distant sound of conversation, in the feeling that someone was always nearby if he needed them. And every evening, Dr. Michael Hayes would stop by. Not as a doctor, as someone who stayed. They talked about simple things at first. Books, old stories, the kind of conversations that didn't require effort. But gradually, those conversations went deeper, about choices, regret, the paths people take, and the ones they leave behind. Daniel found himself speaking more than he expected. Not because he had planned to, but because for the first time in years, someone was actually listening. Not waiting for their turn to speak. Not distracted. Just listening. Days passed quietly, and somewhere in that quiet, something began to change. The weight Daniel had carried for so long, the silence, the distance, the feeling of being overlooked, it started to loosen. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough for him to notice. He wasn't invisible here. He wasn't an obligation. He wasn't someone people made time for when it was convenient. He mattered. In small ways. In conversations. In presence. And for a man who had spent years telling himself he didn't need anything more. That realization stayed with him longer than the pain in his chest ever did. 10 days into his recovery, just as the rhythm of quiet healing had begun to feel natural, Daniel Carter's phone rang. Susan knocked softly and stepped inside. "You have a call," she said. "It's Ryan." For a second, Daniel didn't move. Then his hand tightened slightly as he reached for the phone. "Hey, Dad." Ryan's voice came through smooth, casual, as if nothing had happened, as if there hadn't been days of silence, as if a number hadn't been blocked when it mattered most. Daniel's chest felt heavier, and not because of the surgery. "I had major heart surgery," he said quietly. "Where have you been?" There was a brief pause, just long enough to notice. "Work's been crazy," Ryan replied. "You know how it is. But I'm calling now, right? I wanted to check in. See how you're doing. Check in." The words landed flat. "I'm recovering," Daniel said. "Somewhere else." "Yeah, about that," Ryan continued, his tone shifting slightly. Sharper. More focused. "I called the hospital. They said you weren't discharged home. Where are you staying?" Daniel hesitated, then gave the address. There was a silence on the other end. But this time, it felt different. Not concerned. Calculation. "Lakeshore Drive?" Ryan repeated. "Whose house is that?" "A friend's." Another pause, shorter now. "Lauren and I will come by," Ryan said quickly. "We should see you. Make sure everything's okay." Before Daniel could respond, the call ended. That Sunday, the doorbell rang exactly on time. James Walker opened the door, and Ryan stepped inside, as he belonged there. Lauren followed close behind, her eyes scanning everything, the high ceilings, the polished floors, the kind of details that didn't go unnoticed. "Wow," Ryan said, letting out a low whistle. "Dad didn't mention he was staying somewhere like this." Daniel watched from across the room, sitting quietly as they entered. Ryan approached with a smile that felt just a little too practiced. "Dad," he said, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder, "you're looking good, really good." It was the first time he had touched him in months, maybe longer. Daniel didn't respond right away. Lauren stepped closer, her voice softer but no less observant. "This place is incredible," she said. "Your friend must be very successful." At that moment, Dr. Michael Hayes stepped into the room. Recognition flashed across Ryan's face almost instantly. "Dr. Hayes," he said, his tone shifting again. "Respectful now. Measured. Of course, I've heard of you." The energy in the room changed. Subtly, but unmistakably. Ryan straightened slightly. His posture is more controlled. His words are more careful. "I can't thank you enough for taking care of my father," he continued. "This is above and beyond." Dr. Hayes nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Your father needed help," he said calmly, "so I helped." Ryan smiled again, but this time there was something behind it. Not warmth, not relief, something sharper. As the conversation moved forward, Daniel noticed it clearly now. The way Ryan listened, not like a son reconnecting with his father, but like someone assessing a situation, measuring value, weighing opportunity. Every glance at the house, every question about arrangements, every carefully chosen word. It wasn't about him. It was about where he was and who he was with. And for the first time, Daniel didn't feel confused. He understood. Ryan hadn't come back because he cared. He had come back because he saw something worth reaching for. Dr. Michael Hayes closed the study door with quiet precision, shutting out the polite conversation still lingering in the living room. Ryan Carter stood across from him, no longer smiling. The performance had dropped. "What exactly is going on here?" Ryan asked, his voice lower now, tense. Dr. Hayes didn't answer immediately. He walked behind his desk, opened a drawer, and placed a thin folder on the surface between them. "What's going on?" he said calmly. "Is that your father nearly died, and you weren't there?" Ryan's jaw tightened. "I told him I was working. I had obligations. And yet," Dr. Hayes replied, "you found time to be here today." Silence. Heavy. Unavoidable. Ryan looked away first. "You don't understand my situation." "No," Dr. Hayes said. "I understand it very clearly." He slid the folder forward. Ryan hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a single check. $75,000. Ryan's breath caught, just for a second. "That amount," Dr. Hayes continued, "covers your immediate debts, buys you time, gives you a way out of the situation you've been hiding." Ryan's eyes snapped up. "How do you—" "I made a few calls," Dr. Hayes said simply. "Your firm is losing clients. Your expenses are exceeding your income. You're leveraged beyond what you can sustain." Ryan closed the folder slowly. The room felt smaller now. "You had no right." "I had every right," Dr. Hayes interrupted, still calm. "Because your father is under my care, and I needed to understand why his own son disappeared when he needed him most." Ryan didn't respond, because there was nothing left to say. Dr. Hayes leaned forward slightly. "This money comes with conditions." Ryan let out a dry breath. "Of course it does." "First," Dr. Hayes said, "you use it to stabilize your life, not to maintain appearances." Ryan nodded faintly. "Second, you repair your relationship with your father, not because it benefits you, but because it's your responsibility." That one hit harder. Ryan's expression shifted. "And third," Dr. Hayes added, "you will never ask him or me for money again." Silence filled the room again. Ryan stared at the check, then closed the folder completely. "You're asking me to earn something I already should have been doing," he said quietly. Yes, Dr. Hayes replied. Exactly. They returned to the garden where Daniel was waiting. The air felt different now. Ryan walked more slowly this time. No performance, no rehearsed tone. Just wait. Dad, he said, stopping a few steps away. Daniel looked up at him. No anger, no raised voice. Just quiet. I messed up, Ryan said. Not just recently, for a long time. Daniel didn't interrupt. I told myself I was busy, that I'd fix things later, that you'd understand, Ryan continued. But the truth is, I avoided you. His voice cracked slightly. Because I didn't want you to see what I'd become. Daniel's eyes stayed on him. And what is that? He asked. Ryan swallowed. Someone who forgot where he came from. The words hung in the air. Raw. Honest. For the first time since he arrived, there was no calculation left in his face. Just regret. Daniel exhaled slowly. You didn't just forget, he said. You chose not to remember. Ryan nodded. I know. A long pause followed. Then Daniel shifted slightly, the movement careful, still healing. I raised you to be better than me, he said. Not richer, not more successful, better. Ryan's eyes dropped. I failed you. Daniel studied him for a moment, then spoke again, softer this time. You did, he said, but that doesn't mean you're done. Ryan looked up. There it was. Not forgiveness, but something else. A chance. What are you going to do about it? Daniel asked. Ryan took a breath, then answered, without hesitation this time. I'm going to fix it. And for the first time, it didn't sound like a promise. It sounded like a decision. Change didn't happen overnight. There was no sudden transformation, no perfect apology that erased everything that had come before. What followed instead was something quieter, slower, and far more difficult. Ryan Carter began to show up. At first, it was just phone calls, short, careful, twice a week, like a routine he didn't trust himself to break. The conversations felt awkward in the beginning, filled with pauses and words chosen too carefully. But he didn't stop. He kept calling. He asked questions, and this time, he stayed long enough to hear the answers. A few days later, the visits started. Every Sunday. Not always comfortable, not always smooth, but consistent. Ryan would sit across from Daniel in the living room, sometimes talking, sometimes just being there. No phone in his hand, no distractions pulling him away. Just presence, something he had once taken for granted. Lauren came a few times in the beginning, quieter now, less certain of her place in the room. Over time, even she seemed to understand that this wasn't about appearances anymore. It was about repair. Ryan also made a decision he had avoided for years. He went to therapy. At first, he didn't talk much about it, just mentioned it in passing, almost like an obligation. But gradually, the change became visible, in the way he listened, in the way he responded. In the way, he stopped deflecting when things became uncomfortable. He started taking responsibility, not just for his actions, but for the patterns behind them. I didn't know how to deal with failure, he admitted one afternoon, so I pretended it wasn't happening, and I pushed away the one person who would have helped me face it. Daniel didn't answer right away. He didn't need to, because for the first time, Ryan wasn't explaining. He was understanding. Weeks turned into months. The distance that had taken years to build didn't disappear, but it began to shrink, slowly, carefully, through small moments that mattered more than any grand gesture ever could. A shared meal, a longer conversation, a question asked without fear of the answer. Trust didn't return all at once, but it returned in pieces. And Ryan, for the first time in a long time, was willing to earn every single one of them. A year after the surgery, Daniel Carter stood in the same house that had once felt like a place he didn't belong, and realized it had quietly become home. What began as 2 weeks of recovery had turned into something neither he nor Dr. Michael Hayes had planned, but both of them understood. There was no longer a need to leave. No reason to return to the silence he once called independence. So Daniel stayed, not as a guest, but as someone who was wanted. Life settled into a rhythm built on simple things: shared meals, long conversations, quiet evenings that no longer felt empty. And somewhere along the way, what started as gratitude became something deeper. Not an obligation, not repayment, family. When Dr. Hayes passed peacefully in his sleep years later, the loss didn't feel like losing a doctor or even a friend. It felt like losing a brother. At the reading of the will, Daniel sat in silence as the attorney spoke words he never expected to hear. The house, the investments, everything, left to him. Along with a note, a single piece of paper, written in steady, familiar handwriting. 35 years ago, you gave me $500 and a reason to keep going. I'm not repaying a debt. I'm continuing what you started. Use this to help others. Be someone's reason. Daniel read it twice, then folded it carefully, because he understood. Wealth, he realized, was never about what you keep. It was about what you choose to give. In the years that followed, Daniel created a foundation in Dr. Hayes's name, providing small grants to students who reminded him of the man Hayes once was and the man he himself had once quietly helped. Each recipient received an envelope, $500, and a note. Keep going. Someone believes in you. Ryan's life changed too, not through sudden success, but through steady correction. He downsized, rebuilt his career, and most importantly, rebuilt something far more valuable: his relationship with his father. He showed up every week, not because he had to, but because he chose to. And that choice, repeated over time, became something real again. Because in the end, Daniel understood something most people learn too late. Family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by presence, by who stands beside you when things fall apart, and who stays when there's nothing to gain. Money can change comfort, but it can never buy respect. And sometimes, the greatest acts of love are the quiet ones no one sees, until they come back when you need them most. So here's the question that stayed with Daniel Carter. When the moment comes, when someone you love is at their lowest, will you show up, or will you give them a reason to remember that you didn't?